So there are two related issues here. One is that the United States government and its various agencies recognize the power of information and of the information war. So I'd like to come back to that in a minute, but that I think is a fundamental issue here. Related to that, and the specific issue of the Afghanistan, Iraq material, but also just all the State Department material, is the United States, like any government, doesn't want its internal discussions known. And, governments have let's say, some element of secrecy. All governments do. Here, what happened was that the United States was actually lying in public about particular war crimes, specific war crimes. So, for instance, there was a specific attack on people in New Baghdad city but in that attack, 2 journalists were killed. Now, it was very clear that the kind of helicopters that conducted the attack had a camera. It's very clear. They all have cameras. They film everything. A US journalist close to the government published a book in which he referred to the footage, that he apparently had seen. And he said, these camera people were there was shooting and so on. He described the footage in a certain way. Well, Reuters, who had employed those 2 camera people, had for a long time asked for the footage. The US government said there's no footage. Now, in the dump from Chelsea Manning, that footage was there. And that footage proved that a war crime had been committed. And because the footage was released, soldiers, US soldiers who were on the ground, who were sensitive people, came out and said this was an outrageous war crime that we participated in one way or the other. So it's important to look, I understand governments need some element of privacy. A government is a complicated institution. I get it. On the other hand, they are lying to the public about a war crime. And so those specific instances were revealed by the WikiLeaks organization because Chelsea Manning gave them, that State Department material and so on. So that's a very important point. It pokes through, in a way, not the hypocrisy alone, but also I think, let's put it plainly, these are illegal denials. You've committed a war crime, you have evidence of the war crime, and you're refusing to reveal it, to protect God knows who. So that's I think, what the real impact of that dump was. Not just that, we got to hear what this ambassador said to this person about this other country and the gossip and so on, who came into the embassy and met them, all that stuff. Okay, that was interesting. But the heart of it was that it actually verified war crimes. Now, United States knows the power of information war. Right now, it's conducting a serious information war against China. It's saying that China is a human rights violator, China is this, China is that. And therefore, if China is the human rights violator, the United States wants to portray itself as the opposite. It's very careful with the information war. It has been so since the 1940s. I've looked at US documents talking about the importance of psychological warfare. That's what they mean. It's the information war. So what the WikiLeaks dump did was, it actually poked a hole through the campaign to portray the United States as a defender of human rights. And I think that's the reason Julian Assange had to be punished. And that's why they're so vindictive about him. They want him to die, as you saw with the revelations regarding the CIA. Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks Corporation, Chelsea Manning, each of them have poked a big hole through the US narrative that it's a defender of human rights. And that's a pretty significant thing in this great battle of ideas, where the US believes that because it controls so many of the institutions of communication, that it dominates. Let's also be a little frank. It's not that the global left hasn't, since the inception of the left, been incredibly divisive. There was, after all, the great dispute between the USSR and the People's Republic of China, Yugoslavia, Albania. Inside India itself, we've had great discussions, and the left has been deeply divided. At least one of you was a JNU student. Half the time at the tea rooms, I'm not sure whether the two people who are fighting with each other, there's no right-wing person in the room. There are two factions of the left duking it out as if it's the end of the world at stake. This is a part of our problem, I think. Our problem, to some extent, is that we have a very acute sense of the crisis, of the capitalist crisis, of the imperialist crisis. We have a very good analysis. We have a general strategic orientation, which most people agree with. There are some differences, but most people agree with the general strategic orientation. But then there are deep tactical divides. And these tactical divides somehow break apart the attempt at creating unity in action. We can't have unity in action if you disagree tactically. If you have a tactical disagreement, you can't even have unity in action. Forget unity in any other way. So this is a problem in left culture globally. And I think we need to sort it out. We need to think about it. We need to build trust among people. Say, okay, you have a different tactical orientation, but surely you're not opposed to coming for a demonstration, against, say, the killing of Muslims in Northeast Delhi. Surely that's a place where we can all unite and go. And you may differ on your opinion about, Lalu Prasad Yadav, or you may differ about your opinion about whether to have, a tie-up with XYZ. But the point is that we agree on this, let's go. But because there's such ill will and ill feeling, it doesn't happen. The question of China is a specific question. This has two parts to it. One is there's a section of the left that is averse to any state project. There is a kind of libertarian or anarchism in the left, which is against any state project. In a sense, you confront that politics and say you just don't want to take power. You just want to be a permanent opposition. Because once you take power, there are compromises you have to make. There is the messiness of reality. You're going to have to do certain things. You're going to have to take risks. You're going to have to prepare to fail, and so on. So one side of it, this libertarian side, just doesn't like state projects, whether it's China, Venezuela, Cuba, you name it. And to some extent, Trotskyism is a subsection of anarcho-libertarianism. The Trotskyite position against state capitalism strikes me as very similar to the anarcho-libertarian position against any state. Look, what are you going to build socialism upon? You're going to build it on capitalism. You're going to have to take the capitalist relations of production and transform them into socialist relations. This smear of state, Cuba is state capital. What do you expect the Cuban leadership to do? What do you expect the revolutionaries to do? To say, okay, listen, fellas, we're going to just have a clean slate and we're going to create perfection. It doesn't work like that. Anarcho-libertarianism has a fantasy of socialism. It doesn't want to take power, and if it would ever take power, it would not know what to do. So I think that's one part of the problem. The second part of the problem is there is an immense hybrid war against the Chinese project right now in particular. It's intensified. The big talk about what's happening in Xinjiang or Taiwan or Hong Kong and so on, the ramped up, statements about authoritarianism in China. There's a fever pitch to this, and lots of people on the left are not willing to stand up against it, including in India. I'm often surprised by the CPI-ML's statements, liberation statements on China. Reads to me like the US State Department documents. It's a very similar kind of thing. You got to have the guts to stand up against the hybrid war. What's going on in Xinjiang? Let's take a look at it. That's not your question to me. Your question to me is, can there be a global left? Look, frankly, the Chinese the Communist Party of China has 90-odd million people in it. 90-odd million people in it, okay? That's bigger than most countries in the world. 90 million people. Obviously, there's a range of opinions. Obviously, there is a wealth of debate and discussion and so on. It's also true that during the period after 1990s, the party went decidedly in a rightward direction. That's true. I think nobody denies that. And it's also true that since the emergence of Xi Jinping, there's been a move to go to the left. This is an inner-party big debate. Now, you may not like Xi Jinping's personality. I don't know what people react when they say, oh, he's authoritarian. What are you talking about? How do you expect one person to run a whole state project in, kind of dictatorial way. It's not possible. He has to deal with incredible debates in that party. The very fact that that Xi Jinping is different from Hu Jintao, from Jiang Zemin, including from Deng Xiaoping, in terms of his orientation, means that this party is in ferment. It's in debate and dispute and so on. Yes, the state acts sometimes in a way that is where it just says no more debate. Now we're going to do something. That's a problem of statecraft. That's not a problem of China. In every state, the state forecloses debate at some point and says, look, we're going to do this. Look, we got to build a road, okay? We're going to build the road. Let's have a little debate, okay? You don't want it, you want it, and so on. Now you've got the engineers, surveyors, and this is the road. It's going to be built. Now, you can say that's authoritarian. Is that authoritarian or is that efficient? During the pandemic, they just closed down, Hubei province and Wuhan. And the Chinese have basically obliterated, COVID-19. Initially, the West said, this is authoritarian, look what they're doing. I mean, what were they doing? Community groups are all over the place. People who talk like that often have not an experience of China. Every time I've been to China, I'm actually quite, I marvel at how much activity takes place, community organizations, neighborhood groups, and so on. It's a very diverse society. When you go onto a college campus, my friends, you think GNU is a vibrant place. There are neoliberals, there are US-style liberals, there are Maoists, there are all kinds of people on the campus. In fact, the head of the Chinese central bank is a neoliberal. That's just a fact of life. I mean, it would be authoritarian if the Chinese Communist Party showed up and just purged everybody and said only Xi Jinping thinkers can have official posts. That's not true. It doesn't work like that. I mean, you talk about authoritarian. Look at what the Modi government has done to the institutions, removed heads of vice chancellors, put in place whoever, I mean, it's wrong because they've put in people who I generally don't think are qualified, but it's also their right to do it. That the fact of a state operating as a state cannot be considered authoritarian. That's the habits of the state. Now, do we want to create statecraft that doesn't have those habits? Of course we do. Can we do it immediately? I don't think so. It's going to take a long time before we get to the point in human development where states behave differently. Look, it's part of the kind of character that we've inherited, okay? This Babugiri attitude, Dadagiri, Babugiri attitude. It's not an Indian thing. It's a problem of big scale institutions. You put somebody in charge of a desk and you have a line form in front of them. This person is going to feel powerful and they're going to feel like they have the right to say, okay, I'm going for tea break now. Okay, it's closed. Okay, get out. This attitude, it's going to take a long process to change this attitude. It's not particular to China or to some Indian Babu or whatever. This is a problem of statecraft. And it's a problem of human development. It takes time. But all of this is closed off, foreclosed, China, authoritarian. Come on, let's be a little more, let's say, realistic about how the world works. And, periodicals like Jacobin and so on, what happens is that because there's so much pressure on them, so much pressure from all kinds of sides, and, let's not put it past the worst kind of intelligence agencies to intensify the pressure. So much pressure that they buckle. And every once in a while say, well, let's do a story revealing what's happening in Xinjiang. But you're repeating the talking points. Well, the first thing is, look, I don't have any problem with anarcho-syndicalism. My problem is that anarcho-libertarian traditions and some Trotskyite traditions have an impatience with state building. That's my problem. It's not with the tradition. It's that that tradition seems to be impatient with state building. States have to be built, at least for a long transitional period. You have to deliver things, otherwise your class enemy is going to thwart you. Your class enemy wants no state. They are the ones who would love at least no state that regulates for social welfare, state that maintains law and order and so on. They in that sense, there is some kind of unity. So that's my real problem. And as far as what Trotsky wrote, I mean, I would like to have a dialogue with Trotsky and ask him, you see, comrade, what would you do differently in a society like the Soviet Union, the USSR, which, like India, was a backward country? And by backward, I don't mean backward in some, civilizational sense. Backward in the sense that it was internally colonized. Look at India. When the British left, literacy was around 13%. You're going to have to fight tooth and nail to create literacy in the country. You can't fantasize about the population. In 1947, you can't turn around and say, we're going to bring democracy tomorrow. Democracy is a process. You can't have democracy in a country which is, 87% illiteracy. Democracy doesn't happen overnight. Democracy is a process. People have to fight to become democratic, because democracy in the modern sense means you have, no problem with hunger. Hunger is abolished. Literacy is established. Ill health is taken care of by a medical system. That's democracy. Democracy isn't just the right to vote, okay? That's ridiculous. Democracy means the fullness of the human personality is realized. That's my opinion, So that means in 1948, 49, 50, when you're writing the constitution in India, finally when there's an election, that election is part of a process to establish democracy. It's the same in the USSR. You have a revolution in 1917. That's the beginning of the process, Then you have to establish the process. What would Leon have done differently? And there's another aspect to this I want to tell you, which is that it's really interesting. We don't talk about it much. There's a class divide here. Trotsky comes from a middle-class family. Stalin's mother was a domestic worker. They were field workers. Khrushchev's parents were field workers. They had a level of class hatred that Trotsky, with the kind of liberalism of attitude towards others, would never have had. Stalin hated the bourgeoisie. You can see it comes across not in his writings, but in writings about him. He hated the bourgeoisie. They treated his mother with such malice. There was a great class hatred. And we don't think about that, comrades. We don't think about what that means. When you've been generations of field workers who have been deprived things, the level of anger you might feel is very strong. And there are things that were done perhaps right or wrong, but they perhaps came from there. And we should recognize that. But that's not what you're asking me. You're asking me, why aren't you a wholesale defender of the Chinese position or the Chinese government position on Xinjiang? That's what you want to know. Well, look, before I became a historian, I was a journalist, and I continued to be a journalist. I don't feel comfortable writing about things I haven't reported directly. I've never been to Xinjiang, and this is not a cop-out. It's an ethical position as a journalist. I know what I know, and I write about what I know. I don't write about things I don't know as much as possible. I travel all over the place. I write about things that I have reported and seen. I was a young journalist in India when I reported on the riots of 1993 in Selampur and Northeast Delhi and so on. I have a vivid understanding of what it means to have been on the streets, watching people get killed and so on. And that will never go from me. And I just don't think a journalist should write about things they don't know. Rob Griffith has been there. He has written about what he's seen. That's fine. I have interviewed lots of people who've been to Xinjiang and so on. That's okay. But I don't want to write about something I don't know. I write about what I know. What do I know? I know that there is a hyped up information war, and some of it is incoherent. I know that Adrian Zenj is not the kind of person I would like to take my information from. I know, for instance, having talked to professors who teach in Urumqi, I talked to a few of them. One of them, she wrote her dissertation on the cotton industry in southern Xinjiang. I've talked to them about mechanization and, their understanding that the slave labor, the argument, it doesn't fly, it doesn't apply. It's in fact highly productive cotton, it's a highly productive cotton industry. It's not very productive to have slave labor, by the way. The efficiency rates are not high, as high as they could be. And so whatever. The point is, it's not that I'm ducking the question. I'm quite happy to write about things, that are controversial, as it were. But why get into this when I haven't been there? And I would like to go there. I also want to say that, and I know that I've been to the Wakhan corridor area of Afghanistan. and I have seen the real threats posed to Central Asian and Chinese countries by highly dangerous extremists. I met some of the Uyghur extremists in Turkey when I was covering the Syria war. These people are not compromisers, okay? They have a deep hatred of the Chinese government and so on. So I understand that the Chinese government needs to do something to deal with this. What's better? Is it better to have large-scale, a project of educating people, or is it better to throw everybody in prison, or is it better to do what, say, the Indian government is doing in Kashmir, lock the whole place down, have an enormous military presence, and so on? It's fascinating, all these people yelling and screaming about Xinjiang. What's going on in Kashmir? UN has actually said that the numbers of people who are hungry now are about 2.7 billion. That's 1 in 3 people on the planet. I mean, you talked about the global left. I think the left will have no leg to stand on if we don't fight fundamentally to abolish hunger. Now, everything follows after that. You can't build any society if people are hungry. Okay, I mean, it's just you can't educate children who are hungry because everybody who has ever at least experienced hunger or talked to somebody who's been hungry knows about that noise. It's something that haunts me, this noise that is in the head of a hungry person. It's like a roar, like the ocean sound. You can't hear what a teacher is saying. You can't. Everything follows. So many of the diseases we have that are horrendous are because of malnutrition. So many of the diseases, including tuberculosis, these are all diseases of poverty. Cholera, tuberculosis, the biggest killers in the world. Malaria, these are killers of poverty. And they result largely from malnutrition. Malaria. I mean, if you are a middle class, upper middle class person, you contract malaria, you can make it out of malaria. You have enough reserves in your body, fat reserves and so on. If you're a poor malnutrition person, you get malaria, you're dead. You get tuberculosis, you're dead. These are diseases of hunger when they kill you. So the left has to focus on hunger. No left project that comes to power can put off dealing with hunger. That's why it was so important what Lula da Silva did in Brazil. He started a project called Fome Zero, Zero Hunger, a very powerful project. And while Lula and then Dilma were in power, hunger rates dropped in Brazil. After Temer and Bolsonaro, the right wing came, hunger rates went up. Same in India, by the way. During the UPA government, under Manmohan Singh, with the left outside support, hunger rates started to drop. When the BJP came, it's risen. This whole fraud of yelling now, screaming and yelling and abusing the global hunger index by the Indian government, it's so embarrassing because they don't know how to read statistics. I mean, that's the basic thing. The ranking has changed because some countries didn't report. It's ridiculous, it's juvenile. It's quite a shame because India used to have a great planning commission. I don't know what they're doing in the Niti Aayog nowadays. I don't know what kind of mathematics they adhere to, but certainly they don't seem to really understand statistics. And it was embarrassing. I thought their argument against the FAO and then against the Global Hunger Index. Your question is a good one. And I think that, when you think about Yemen, you think about war, but you must also think about hunger because there about half the population is struggling with near famine conditions as a consequence partly of the war prosecuted now almost alone by Saudi Arabia. The UAE basically pulled out a few years ago. Saudi Arabia prosecuting a terrible war. But I want to actually shift it from there because you raised something earlier about the left period in Yemen. When you look at Afghanistan, you look at Yemen, you look at Sudan, the missed opportunities, the grotesque missed opportunities. When Yemen won its independence from Britain, it moved immediately into a socialist project, particularly the South, of course. But even in the North, it was a Republican government. It was left of center republicanism, a little bit like the government that you had in Egypt, under Nasser, left of center republicanism. But the South Yemeni government, did something identical to the Afghans about 10 years later. South Yemen was 10 years before, 10 years later, which is they immediately went against hunger and illiteracy. They sent people out into rural Yemen to teach young people how to read. Alongside that, they fed them midday meals. This midday meal business, so important for schools to provide. And that was the promise of Yemen, of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, the left had just, a tiny amount of time to practice genuine democracy, to attempt the process of democracy. But it was crushed because, some people in the world just can't tolerate, socialism taking place in these parts of the world. They just can't tolerate it. I just feel like, look, let's not even call it socialist or communist or whatever. Let's call it, I don't know, what M.N. Roy ended up with, humanism or something like that. It doesn't matter what it's called. You got to have a project that eliminates hunger, that provides education, that provides institutions of medical care, that provides people with housing, that essentially validates and realizes the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN is eradicate hunger. Let's go for it. Let's tell the liberals, you've signed up for the SDGs, let's go for it. But they don't want to go for it, and that's why the name of the government that actually goes for that agenda becomes socialist, becomes communist. There's a reason why the name of those governments is socialist, because the liberals like the ideas, but they don't want to actually put them into practice. The conservatives hate the ideas, It's the socialists who end up both liking the ideas and wanting to implement them. That's why the Yemeni government was a Marxist government. That's why the Afghan government was a Marxist government. That's why the biggest communist party in Africa was in Sudan. The Sudanese Communist Party is leading the protests alongside the teachers' union against this military coup. If only these countries could have had a chance, if only. Look, as well as I do, better than I do, that there is an environmental catastrophe inside India and has been for a long time. Some of it dating back to the colonial times. There's an area in Bihar where the coal seam has been on fire for over 100 years, and it's not been put out. 100 years, a coal seam has been on fire. People walk on the ground, on the surface, it's hot. It's insane. We know that there's all kinds of illegal logging, deforestation. Some of this is played into the hands of the kind of anti-tribal sentiment, anti-Adivasi sentiment, encroachment into Adivasi areas and so on. We know that this exists. We know that our cities are bathed in plastic. There must be the great holy cow eating plastic bags all over the place. Who's worrying about the cow's stomach, in all that? The filth in the rivers, this whole, every few years we'll clean the Ganga, nothing happens. The filthy, dirt keeps getting thrown into it, industrial waste, human waste, and so on. And then on top of that, air pollution, and you would expect the middle class to revolt. Look, my theory of the middle class is a class motivated by convenience. Okay, bear with me. What inconveniences the middle class is what riles it to politics. For instance, can't get my child into school, I am angry. There is a traffic jam, I am angry. There is load shedding, I am angry. Water is not coming, I am angry. These are inconveniences. I can't afford to go on holiday, my one holiday of the year, I am angry. The middle class is angered by inconvenience. My God, living in most Indian cities is a cascade of inconvenience. Water problem, load shedding, the air cannot be breathed, you can't get your children into school. Even the metro in Delhi is so crowded, it's become like Japan. They're soon going to hire people to push you into the train, stuff you in. And the middle class is just sitting back. They are more prone to political action when it comes to defending a temple or, why did the Pakistani team beat the Indian team, they go nuts on social media. But I don't know. In the West, the movements on environment are actually middle class movements. They are not working class movements. They are not, movements of the masses. These are middle class movements. Let's be fair. A lot of them middle class kids. Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement. These are middle class kids. Where's the Indian middle class? It's not motivated in this way. I don't know. Maybe we have an attitude that this is what we get. Maybe it's correct, all this talk about karma and all this nonsense. Maybe it afflicts the middle class. It certainly doesn't afflict the farmers. Farmers don't believe it's their karma. They are out there protesting. Doesn't it afflict the workers? They seem to be out there protesting. It seems to be an affliction of the Indian middle class. What's the problem with the Indian middle class? Okay, on inflation, tomato prices up, onion prices up. You don't see demonstrations. You don't see the middle class showing up with banners saying, bring the tomato price down. Caste is a wretched institution. And I've thought that since my childhood, and that a frontal attack on caste is very important because it holds India back in many ways from developing socially. I just think it's a horrible institution. I never understood it, frankly, if I'm honest with you. I inherited this attitude from my parents, and I just thought it was absurd. Totally anachronistic as an institution. Then I experienced the Delhi riots. And we're talking now on the 1st of November. This is the weekend when 3,000 Sikhs were killed in Delhi in 1984. I experienced that directly. I come from part of my background is from a Sikh family. It was very personal, that violence. And there were all these rumors in Delhi at the time that the killing was done by Balmikis. And I thought that's interesting. And I found it so strange that poor people will kill other people who are not powerful. I found that strange. And it happens all the time in history. If you saw Issam Sani's Tamas, or if you read the novel, it opens with a scene where a Dalit actually throws a piece of meat, because after all, which Brahmin is going to go and kill an animal and throw it into a mosque and so on, particularly a pig. And so Tamas begins with the Dalit actually conducting this act on behalf of the upper caste or the dominant caste. And so I was very much interested in this. I didn't know much about the Balmiki community until I started this research, spent years traveling in Punjab, in Western UP, in Himachal Pradesh, in all parts of Delhi, in bits of Rajasthan, met, tens of thousands of people. I mean, I'm not joking, because I would enter a village in Punjab where 50% of the population were Dalits, and they would, say, okay, now you must address everybody. I didn't know anything. I was a young kid, but, they said nobody else has come and taken interest in us. And, and so you tell us where you've come from. And I met so many people like that, living in their homes, discussing with them about their lives. And, one of the striking features is that I learned how the grip of Hindutva goes back 100 years and goes back to the Sangathan movement, in the 1920s. The Sangathan movement was this movement to break away, to get Dalits to become Hindus and to actually become Hindus. Dalits were not Hindus. Balmikis were not Hindus. They had their own religion. They worshipped Lal Beg and Bala Shah Nuri, and, my God, these are names I haven't thought about in a long time. And they had their own customs and traditions. And it's, you could say they were part of the kind of Nanak, Ramdas, Bhakti, Sufi. You could say that. And that's true, but it's also not true. Like, Ravidas, for instance, whose poems are in the Granth Sahib, and therefore is revered in the Sikh tradition, of course, is a great leader of the Jatav community and so on, and is a very important saint, and et cetera, et cetera. So what I was interested in is the patience of Hindutva, that for 100 years they worked on this social question. They struggled on the social plane before they went into politics. They knitted together their coalitions and so on. They had a patient 100-year, 200-year project, and they went about this patiently. on the question of caste, for instance, they did it very patiently. They built their coalitions in many parts of the country, didn't succeed in others. And in fact, the left cognate of this is Kerala, where again, the communists start only in the 1930s, but there's a patience in the way the Kerala movement has built up. It's been a social movement. It's been there fighting against irrational ideas. It's pushed a certain agenda. It's led the land reform movement and so on. It had a long-term perspective. I think that's where unity comes in of the left. Left unity is not just a short-term issue, like let's go for this demonstration together. We have to build a common long-term project, And the essence of the project today has to be to intervene culturally and socially, to change the direction of Indian culture. You see, Indian culture is distorted by this long-term victory of Hindutva. They've been able to actually put forward some cultural aspects of their project which have become hegemonic. This idea, for instance, of defending Hindus, it's a hegemonic idea. It exists now. People think it's a real thing, that they're under threat from others and so on. This idea that certain customs are Indian customs is also, like Diwali, for instance. We are on the threshold of Diwali. That Diwali is an Indian festival is a hegemonic victory of the Hindu right. Because Diwali is not actually, an Indian tradition. There are so many traditions in southern India and different parts of India. There are so many. Why isn't Pongal, for instance, an Indian tradition? Why is Diwali this hegemonic thing? So there's a way in which culturally we have to fight back on the plane of diversity. I'm not, listen, you said something earlier about humanism and Althusser and so on. I am not much of a theoretical person in the sense of fighting abstract battles with other people. I'm not really keen on that. I mean, Marxism as a tradition has never been far from humanism. In fact, Marx himself writes with great feeling about human beings, and he says, nothing human is alien to me, and so on. Lenin also, was bitterly opposed to, not considering the human being as a species that needed to be realized. This is a long trajectory. In all our movements, the human question is fundamental. I've been a member of the CPIM for, 30 years now. And I watch, leaders of the CPIM go into people's homes, cradle children, and I think there's a big difference between how our people are in those areas, where there's been a riot, where there's been a killing, and the photo opportunities of the bourgeois parties. There's great feeling in the way people act with other people. If we don't act with feeling, genuine, authentic feeling, we're not recreating humanity. I quote this line all the time from Akbar Allahabadi. Aadmi tha badi mushkil se insaan hua. We have to create humanity. And that, I think, that's the cultural struggle, And in that sense, you can't just say, oh, that's religion. People say, oh, in West Bengal, CPIM, well, you can't just reject religion. It's part of the human experience. You have to build it. As Lenin rightly said, we don't argue about religion on earth. That will be taken care of after we die. We have to establish a different order in society. We don't have that argument. People take solace, the opium, as Marx wrote, they take solace in different traditions. That's okay, but we have to fight to democratize the traditions. I would like to democratize Hinduism. What does that mean? It means caste has to be eradicated completely. There's no room for caste in any of our world. Complete eradication. You want to continue to worship, you can worship, but why do you have to have this system at the heart of it? And let's face it, Hinduism has caste at the heart of it. It is the skeleton of the religion. It has to be removed. You create a different kind of democratic skeleton. Even religion must be democratized. It is not immune from the currents of democracy, from the fresh air of democracy. And so that's, what I would say is that we have to have a long-term project. It's based on the long-term project that certain unities can be built. Unities must not be built only tactically. They must be built in the project. Do all people who accept, say, the broad constitution of India, do all people want to come together to build something? How can you live in a country where, hundreds of millions of people starve every day? What kind of morality is being taught to children? Board examinations should have that as the first question. What will you do in the rest of your life to eradicate hunger? Let that be the first question in the 10th boards, and let children have to actually write and say, I am going to do this. Remember the day, you're too young for this, but when I was young, at the time before liberalization, we used to have to pledge things all the time in school. I pledged this, I pledged that, I pledged never to have nuclear war. Because in my school, we celebrated Hiroshima Day. I pledged never to have nuclear war. I would like to see, 100 million Indian school children pledging, I pledge in my life that I will help to eradicate hunger.